if you would you just use that mouse if you want to point out, because that'll show well on the TV too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay, very good. So I'm going to talk about studies that were done largely in the 2004 to 2006 time frame, a little bit into 2007. Studies of birds, amphibians, and the mapping of wildlife habitats in the mine study area. So this is going to be a summary in nature. There's a lot of detail in the EBD, but I'm just going to give you sort of an overview, the take-home points from this work that we did. So first I'll talk about avian studies, the methodology for avian studies, habitat mapping methods, an overview of the habitat mapping results and bird occurrence in the mine study area, and then a quick overview of a study we did to look at the occurrence of wood frogs in the mine study area. And then I'll finish up with a look at habitat use evaluations for several bird species that we conducted in the mine study area based on the habitat mapping that was done. So as I said, this work was largely done in the 2004 to 2006 time frame. We surveyed for nesting raptors 2004 to 2006, a number of different surveys for migrating and breeding water birds. This includes waterfowl, loons, and grebes. Also gulls, terns, jaegers, they fall in this amorphous group that we term water birds. Those were done in 2004 to 2005. Breeding shorebirds and breeding land birds were surveyed together in some ground-based surveys I'll talk about in a minute in 2004 and 2005. And then we did an occurrence study for wood frogs, the only breeding amphibian in the continental part of the Alaskan landscape in 2007. And then wildlife habitats, we did ground-based surveys for that work in 2004 and 2005. Much of the mapping was then completed in 2010 and 2011. So avian studies methodologies. First, the raptor surveys. We broke our surveys up into two focal groups, cliff nesting species and tree nesting species. Cliff nesters include rough-legged hawk, golden eagle, gyrfalcon, peregrine falcon, and then in parentheses there you've got common raven. Not a raptor, in fact it's a passerine, but they build nests on cliff faces and bluffs, which raptors often reuse in subsequent years. So you gain information on availability of nest sites by surveying for ravens also. Tree nesting species include osprey, bald eagle, northern goshawk, red-tailed hawk, merlin, a small falcon, and great horned owl. These are the focal species that we were searching for, but we recorded all raptors when we observed them in the field. So these surveys were done, well, there were two different surveys. We did nest occupancy, which is early in the season, so you're looking for birds on nests, and then you follow up later in the season in July, what we call productivity surveys, so you're checking those same nests and looking for fledglings. So you're trying to quantify hatching success at each nest. And then we did a short early winter bald eagle survey in November, and that was done in the mine site and along the road corridor as well. And that was done by both fixed wing and helicopter. So all of these were aerial surveys for raptors. And for water birds, we did a number of different surveys. Most of these were aerial surveys. Spring and fall migrant water birds were surveyed by fixed wing aircraft. We also used fixed wing to survey for breeding and molting waterfowl in the mine area. Fixed wing again was used for breeding swan surveys. And then we used helicopters to look for nesting gulls and their related kin, such as Jaegers. This work was focused in water bodies, riverine, lacustrine water bodies, and wetland habitats in the mine area. And then a separate survey, also by helicopter, for breeding harlequin ducks along the stream systems running from the mine area. We use Fish and Wildlife Service protocols to calculate breeding densities for waterfowl, and then followed that up with brood rearing surveys in the mine area. Brood rearing surveys were done on foot in locations where nests were previously located during the breeding surveys. So quite a number of different surveys here, fixed-wing helicopter and ground-based. And then shorebird and landbird, these were all ground-based surveys during the breeding season. We were surveying all habitats, all terrestrial and freshwater aquatic habitats, except for open water bodies. These were standard point count surveys where you're surveying for a 10-minute period at each point. You record all birds that are seen and heard. Most of the observations are auditory, so you have to know your bird songs and calls pretty well. We also recorded additional observations when moving between sample points in the field. So wildlife habitat mapping, quite a different protocol. The goal here was to map vegetation primarily and to combine that with other landscape features, primarily physiography, and come up with wildlife habitat types that reflect use by wildlife better than a simple vegetation map alone. And the goal in this was to use this information to conduct habitat use evaluations for the specific wildlife species of concern in the mine area. So the first step in habitat mapping was to get the vegetation map polygons prepared by 3PPI and HDR, which you heard about this morning. And when those data were completed, we mapped physiography. This is alpine, upland, lacustrine, lowland, riverine, these broad landscape classifications. We combine that with the vegetation map polygons, results in a large number of types, and then we aggregate those to come up with habitat types that reflect use by wildlife. That aggregation is based primarily on shared vegetation structure and shared physiography. In some cases, soil drainage is used to refine those habitat types to pull out wetter types as compared to well-drained types if necessary. So what did we find for the mine study area, which I'm sure you probably heard about this morning? The bulk of this area is dominated by dwarf scrub. Large swaths of the landscape are covered with alpine and upland dwarf scrub habitat. There are also, at higher elevations, alpine dwarf scrub, rocky alpine barrens, which can be used by wildlife. There's a group of caribou there in the post-calving season, avoiding insects by seeking wind on the ridgetop. There's tall and low scrub habitats, both in upland and in lowland situations. And of course, there's also low and tall scrub along the riverine courses throughout that mine study area. And then there are also poorly drained wet meadows, both at the lower and the higher elevations. So the results for wildlife habitat mapping in the mine area, overall we defined 25 habitat types. As I mentioned, dwarf scrub is definitely dominant. Here's alpine dwarf scrub at roughly 24% of the study area, upland moist dwarf scrub, another 27% of the study area, so big portions of the area covered in dwarf scrub. Now I've lost my cursor. Here we go. And other ones that cover substantial portions of the area, various categories of low and tall scrub, both alder and willow. And then at the very bottom, some of the more open wetland types. Lowland wet graminoid shrub meadow, lowland ericaceous bog. Let me back up here. So this is a map of the wildlife habitat types and their distribution in the mapped area that we used for the mine study area. The black circle here is the deposit area. So the lighter green shades and the light brown shades are the dwarf scrub types. The darker brown are the taller low shrub and tall shrub habitats, and a few rare occurrences of forest habitat types, and then the darker green are the wetter open wetland habitat types. So what did we find for bird species in the mine area? Overall, during the primarily 2 years of intensive studies, 88 bird species were recorded in 10 species groups. We did not find any threatened or endangered, federally threatened or endangered species. There were 15 species of conservation concern. These are species that may be undergoing population declines, or there are threats, perceived threats to their populations on the wintering grounds or the breeding grounds, but they're not federally listed. They're listed by a number of different management agencies, both state and federal, and conservation groups. So they're not legally protected, but there's concern over them, largely for monitoring efforts, so people pay attention to them during studies like this. So bird species richness, number of species broken down here by the different groups. Waterfowl, we record waterfowl, grouse, ptarmigan, loons, grebes, cormorants, herons, diurnal raptors, cranes, shorebirds, lumped together here is gulls, terns, and jaegers, owls, and then passerines. And as you can see, the avifauna is definitely dominated here by passerines and then waterfowl. Other significant groups, especially in the mine area, I would point out the shorebirds. There's a large number of breeding shorebird species there. Several of those are also species of conservation concern, and then a fair number of diurnal raptors also. So raptors specifically in the mine study area, we recorded 11 species. 2 of those were species of conservation concern. A set of 5 were much more common than the others. The rest are pretty rare or uncommon. Bald eagle, somewhat surprisingly for a well-drained alpine, subalpine area, was the most common breeding species. And some of this is to do with the fact that the study area for breeding raptors was quite a bit bigger than the map I just showed you for the wildlife habitat mapping. So when we were surveying for bald eagles, we were getting into more forested terrain at lower elevations, especially along riverine drainages. So we're picking up more bald eagles that way. So bald eagle, definitely the most common breeding species. Rough-legged hawks, golden eagles, gyrfalcons, and common ravens, all relatively common on cliff faces, which are relatively common in some parts of the mine area. Waterbirds, a total of 33 species were recorded in 8 different groups: geese, ducks, loons, grebes, cormorants, gulls, terns, and jaegers were all represented. 15 of those species were observed during migration only. Another 18 were breeders and migrants. So some of those individuals were moving through the area to breed elsewhere, presumably further north, and some remained to breed locally. So overall, the common species, the waterbird avifauna, is definitely dominated by dabbling ducks, a set of 1, 2, 3, it looks like 6 species here: American widgeon, mallard, northern shoveler, northern pintail, green-winged teal, and greater scaup. Scaup's actually a diver, but the first 5 are dabblers. So a large number of species, but numerically definitely dominated by dabblers and 1 diver. So shorebirds, in the mine area, we've recorded 14 species, which is a relatively large number of species for an upper alpine, subalpine area like this. As you'll hear tomorrow, this was roughly twice the number that we found in the transportation corridor at lower elevations. The most common species here: black-bellied plover, American golden plover, greater yellowlegs, whimbrel, least sandpiper, and Wilson's snipe. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of those species are of conservation concern. Landbirds then. 31 species were recorded in the mine study area in a number of different groups, 14 different groups: ptarmigan, corvids, which are your crows and jays, flycatchers, larks, swallows, chickadees, dippers, 1 species of dipper, 1 species of kinglet, 1 species of old world warbler, the Arctic warbler, thrushes, pipits, warblers, sparrows, and finches were all represented. The landbird community was definitely dominated by several species, though thrushes, warblers, sparrows, and finches in particular were very common. 2 species were extremely common: Wilson's warbler and Savannah sparrow. Golden crowned sparrow also were quite common and recorded repeatedly. And 2 of those landbird species are currently considered of conservation concern. Okay, so wood frogs then, in 2007, we did a survey during May to record breeding wood frogs. These are auditory surveys where you're listening for males calling for mates. Right about this time of year, although this is a later spring, so it would be much later if we were to do it this year. So these are standard calling surveys for male frogs. This was an occupancy survey design, repeated survey design. We used what's called a pseudo double-blind observer method. So the water bodies were visited 2 times by different individuals, which had no information on whether frogs had been recorded at that particular water body previously or not. So this is a map of the water bodies, or well, basically it's a map of the sampling universe. We selected water bodies that had been mapped on a hydrological layer from 2004 aerial photography, I think it was. And we randomly sampled a set of water bodies, or randomly selected a sample of water bodies for sampling in the field. And then if you compare that sample water bodies to those that were determined to have frogs present, there doesn't appear to be a strong spatial pattern. Frogs were in a number of water bodies, but we didn't see any particular pattern to the arrangement. Frogs were detected at 22, which was 19% of the 119 water bodies surveyed. Then we surveyed 86 of those ponds and lakes 2 times. The detectability of frogs was low. We assumed that it was going to be higher when we were designing this study, but the detectability was actually lower than we expected. It was 27%. So you correct for that detectability, and the occupancy rate, the estimated occupancy rate for water bodies in the mine study area is about 50%. This is roughly comparable to a study that was done up in Denali Park several years ago, where I think the occupancy rate was estimated to be about 45%. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about wildlife habitat use evaluations. This is where we're taking the wildlife habitat mapped types and assessing the value of each of those map types to, in this case, a set of bird and mammal species considered of concern for the mine study area. So the first order of business was to select species for this analysis. Those species were selected if they met one of these 5 criteria. Obviously, if they're protected under, for example, the Bald Eagle Protection Act, they would be selected. If they're species of conservation concern, we wanted to include them. Species that are particularly sensitive to disturbance, in this case, this is freshwater habitats. These are indicators of environmental health. 2 species really, tundra swan and harlequin duck fell into that category. And then if they're of concern for management, this is management for subsistence or hunting purposes. This criteria was used largely in the selection of mammal species, but helped with birds also. And then the last one was whether the species is ecologically important as predator or prey, or because of prominent ecosystem effects. The last one really is capturing beaver, which can have substantial effects on aquatic ecosystems. In the mine study area, 25 bird species were selected. As you can see, most of those were selected because of their conservation concern, this column here. So the habitat use evaluation methodology, it's pretty straightforward, really. You overlay your field observations on your habitat map and determine exactly which mapped habitat type was being used at the time of observation. You assess the frequency of use in each habitat type for each species. And then comes the assessment of sampling intensity, whether or not these particular habitats were sampled adequately, or were they undersampled, or were they not sampled at all. For undersampled and unsampled habitats, we augmented the project-specific information with habitat use information, both from the scientific literature and then using professional judgment based upon studies on these species elsewhere in the state, especially in south central and southwestern Alaska. And then we ranked the value of habitat, each mapped habitat type for each species, into 4 classes. High value would be a 3, moderate value is a 2, low is a 1, and negligible gets a 0 value. And these are the descriptions here for bird species. We did the same thing for mammals. So the descriptions of the ranking classes, the 4 classes for mammals, are a little bit different, but it's a very simple categorization into high, moderate, low, and negligible. So habitats classed as moderate and high value would see a fair bit of use, in this case for birds, either during the breeding season or during migration. and low and negligible obviously would see much lower use. So what this results in is an array of habitats. In this case, habitats are the columns and bird species are the rows. And you can run the analyses in a couple different ways. You can assess species richness for each mapped habitat type. How many bird species were categorized as having moderate or high value habitats, or moderate or high value for that particular habitat. And you can also look at it the other way and look at individual bird species and try to pull out those habitats that are important for that particular species as being of high or moderate value. So what does these data look like when you map them? So here's the wildlife habitat types again, just to refresh your memory, with the deposit area here. And then the first map here is species richness. This is for all birds and mammals. I didn't talk about mammals, but we did the same analysis for a set of mammal species also. So you can see that the dark green are the open wetter habitats. Those also tend to support a higher number of species that were categorized as having high or moderate value rankings for those habitats. So the dark purple, 19 to 20 species were ranked as high or moderate value for those habitats. And then lower numbers, 11 to, or what is it here, 13 to 16, 8 to 11, and 3 to 6 species for the lowest category. And then you can look at individual groups. So here's tree nesting raptors. In this case, 4 species were considered: bald eagle, northern goshawk, merlin, and great horned owl. So the dark green and the brown are 3 to 4 and 2 species, respectively, that were categorized as having high or moderate value habitats in the mine area. So you can see that there's really not much good habitat availability for tree nesting raptors. As I mentioned earlier, bald eagle, a tree nesting raptor was the most common species in that area, and the reason is that the survey area for raptors, extended quite a bit beyond the area that was mapped for wildlife habitat types and got into more forested terrain where bald eagles are more common. And then you contrast that with the availability of habitats for cliff nesting species. Here we have 3 species: golden eagle, gyrfalcon, and peregrine falcon. Again, the deeper colors, the dark green and the brown, are greater numbers of species with high and moderate value habitats. So there's quite a bit of habitat for cliff nesting species. This is both nesting habitat and foraging habitat. So there's not cliffs at each of these locations of brown on this map. Obviously, they can only nest where there are cliffs, but there's a lot of foraging habitat for these species in that area. And then water birds as a group, 1, 2, 3, looks like 8 species of water birds considered to be of concern. And the pattern here is that most of the high value habitats for water bird species appear to be clustered in the upper headwaters of the upper Coktuli drainage here, the lower Coktuli there, the mine area here, and then this is the upper Talaric drainage there. So the headwaters of these streams seem to be important habitats for water birds. Shorebirds, a set of 6 species of concern were assessed here, and again, the darker colors are greater numbers of species with high and moderate value habitat rankings. The largest number of species in the wetter habitats, But you also see one or two species widely distributed, the lighter cream color here, and that's largely due to surfbird and American golden plover, which nest in very well-drained, high mountainous areas. More so for surfbird, but a lot of American golden plovers were found at higher elevations there in the mine area, whereas Pacific golden plover seemed to be a little bit lower. And then land birds. 4 species here: willow ptarmigan, rock ptarmigan, considered because of management concern, and then gray-cheeked thrush and black-poll warbler, of conservation concern. The ptarmigan account for the wide distribution of the brown coloration here in the better drained dwarf scrub habitats, and then all three of the 4 species can be found in taller willow, both low willow and alder, and tall willow and alder habitats represented by the dark green there. So land birds distributed pretty broadly throughout the mine area. So that's what I have for an overall summary. And I suppose we can open up to questions now, or how do we work that? Oh, Brian's here. Okay.
Yeah. So I think we'll do Brian, and then we'll do the panel question and answer afterwards.
So you want to run those guys by us, and I'll.
Sure. All right, so while Todd is loading up the presentation, let me introduce Brian Lawhead first, who's going to be giving the next presentation. Brian has been active in both terrestrial and marine biological studies in Alaska since 1975. He's been working at ABR Incorporated since '82, after working for the University of Alaska and various agencies, including the Department of Fish and Game and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He's led numerous studies of caribou in Arctic Alaska and has studied bears, moose, wolves, foxes, and small mammals in southern, interior, and northern Alaska. His research background includes studies of seabirds and marine mammals from the outer Kenai Peninsula to the Aleutians and Bering Sea Islands, as well as bird migration in several interior river basins. And in the last 3 decades, he's managed, authored, and reviewed a variety of environmental impact statements. Brian holds a BS from Cornell and a master's degree in wildlife management from UAF. And then I think probably not until tomorrow, but Robert Day is also here from ABR Incorporated. He's a senior scientist principal. Environmental Research and Services is the subtitle of ABR. He's conducted research on marine and terrestrial topics in Alaska and elsewhere also since '75, and his research interests are primarily on the effects of humans on the environment and on the biology of poorly known and rare species. He's published more than 60 scientific papers on a variety of topics, especially on the biology of birds. Research includes ecology of kitlets, murrelets in Prince William Sound in northern Alaska, the ecology of the northeastern Chukchi Sea, the seasonal and interannual distribution and abundance of seabirds and marine mammals in the northern Gulf of Alaska, effects of EVOS on birds and mammals, the mortality of seabirds and gillnets used by foreign fishing fleets, and the reproductive and feeding biology of seabirds in the Gulf of Alaska, Aleutian Islands, and Bering Sea. He's assisted in research on the effects of oil development on waterfowl in the Prudhoe Bay oil fields and the effects of the Alyeska pipeline terminal on the intertidal and subtidal benthic communities and feeding of fishes, crabs, and shrimps in Port Valdez. He's currently the chief scientist for an interdisciplinary oceanographic study in the northeastern Chukchi Sea. I think there's a lot of UAF people working on that as well. And he's studying the at-sea ecology of seabirds there. He's got his master's in zoology and his PhD in oceanography from UAF, and he's a life member of 9 ornithological societies and was the chair and head of the Executive Council for the Pacific Seabird Group. Then we're going to start off with Brian, who's going to be talking about mammal surveys in the proposed Pebble Project area.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction. The long part of that with the all the distinguished academic credentials is for Bob over there, not for me. So I'm going to talk today about, I'm going to briefly touch on the mammal work that we did for the project between 2004 and 2008, and then a couple of additional pieces of work that we did in 2009 and 2010, which we managed to sneak into the environmental baseline document for completeness. This is an abbreviated talk. I gave this talk at the EBD meeting, the agency meeting in February 2012, and it went like an hour and a half or something. We don't have anything close to that, so I've tried to select slides and focus on methods and some of the highlights of the results. But if anyone wants to dive into it more deeply, we can certainly do that. This photo is it's not a bunch of mosquitoes, it's a bunch of caribou on a snowfield in one of the higher elevation portions of what we call the mine study area. I think this was on Cascanac Mountain in the summertime. They were getting away from mosquitoes. So quickly, I want to just touch make some acknowledgments and touch on a number of people and organizations who contributed to this work, whom we worked with. First of all is the Mulchatna Caribou Herd Technical Working Group, which consists of a committee of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, and among those organizations, I'd like to especially thank Jim Wollington, who's the area biologist in Dillingham, Andy Aderman, who's with Fish and Wildlife Service at the Togiak Refuge, and Judy Putera, formerly with the Lake Clark National Park. She's now elsewhere. And at the Department of Fish and Game, Lem Butler, Earl Becker, Becky Strock, Rob DeLong, Bob Small, Steve Schwartz, Grant Hildebrand, Bruce Dale, and Sean Farley. Some of those are still with Fish and Game, others have departed. Dave Withrow at the National Marine Mammal Laboratory in Seattle, Steve McDonald and Brandy Jacobson with the University of Alaska Museum of the North. Local observers Carl Jensen from Pedro Bay, Raymond Wassily, and James Lamont from New Halen. Mark and Sandy Lang from Lake Clark, Port Ellsworth. A number of fixed-wing pilots and helicopter pilots who brought us home safely, provided excellent piloting skills. So the main objective of the mammal work was to provide information, baseline information, to be used in NEPA documentation for this project. NEPA being the National Environmental Policy Act. I don't know if that's been touched on here so far today, but that was the intention, was to provide adequate information for the affected environment portion of an environmental impact statement. So we used a variety of different methods to investigate mammal occurrence and use of the study area. We reviewed existing information, both published and unpublished. We did some field surveys to assess seasonal distribution and abundance of a number of species in the mine area and transportation corridor to provide further background area-specific data. I should mention that a number of these slides are general to the entire approach. I'll mention the transportation corridor in some of these slides, but we won't really go into the results of that until tomorrow's session, as I understand it. But the approaches were similar between the two areas. We looked at the available data on population surveys and radio telemetry, radio tracking from various agencies, and in the latter years we collaborated on field surveys with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game and worked more closely under a data sharing agreement with the Mulchatna Caribou Herd Technical Working Group. We made an effort to engage local participants in surveys, and we solicited and collected incidental observations from a wide variety of other people working on the project. The primary value of something like that is to give you information on some of the rarer species. This is a list of the species that we either found documentation for or strongly suspected to occur in one or the other part of the project study area, the mine study area, the transportation corridor. It's 40 species. We focused on a smaller list of species for the field surveys. For instance, the small mammals we did not do any field work on, or fur bearers. Instead we used available information from other species inventories that were done by the National Park Service or the University of Alaska Museum, and then we looked at harvest reporting data for most of the fur bearers. We did do some beaver surveys. So the species of primary interest are those that are, well, probably most people refer to as charismatic megafauna, for their value and interest and value for a wide variety of the public: caribou, brown bear, moose, harbor seal. In this case, I'm talking about terrestrial mammals, but harbor seals in Iliamna Lake were lumped into this because it's a non-marine situation. So we did look at harbor seals. I'll talk about that tomorrow under the transportation corridor study area. And then beaver. But we brought whatever information to bear we could from literature review and review of agency reports for the EBD, for the environmental baseline document. In the first 4 years of work, we focused our field work on aerial transects or reconnaissance surveys, depending on the nature of the terrain and the specific portion of the study area. For the mine area, we used a systematic strip transect survey approach from a fixed-wing aircraft flying at 500 feet, looking on either side, or on both sides rather, of the aircraft, one observer on each side, out to a distance of 800 meters. And the purpose of this was to try and get an idea of the occurrence and relative abundance of species in the mine study area. It wasn't intended to provide precise population estimates, which for a fairly small area like the one we were looking at can be problematic. Most of these population estimates for large mammal species that range over broad areas are done on a much larger scale with certain specialized methods. I'll get into that a little bit later on here. So the purpose of these surveys was to try and take seasonal looks for these species of highest interest at certain seasonally important times of year, to try and get an idea of how many animals were in the area and at which times of year. So the spacing was 1.6 kilometers or 1 mile. Early on, we were attempting for 100% coverage, and then in the latter years, we focused on a double count survey method on one side of the aircraft to use 2 observers to try and come up with an estimate of siteability after some review comments at the time. And then in the transportation corridor, we used a similar approach that I'll describe a little bit more tomorrow, also with double count detectability assessment. And then in the eastern part of the transportation corridor, where the terrain really didn't allow transect surveys, we used reconnaissance overflights. We also conducted a moose population survey using methods developed by the Department of Fish and Game called the Geospatial Population Estimator, which uses randomly selected quadrats and intensive sampling to derive population estimates and associated confidence intervals or an estimate of how much variation there is around that population estimate. We did a bear population survey with the Department of Fish and Game in May 2009 using fairly intensive line transect sampling, distance sampling. We did some visual observations early on along salmon spawning streams in 2004, and then collected incidental sightings of bears during harlequin duck surveys in the next year. We did bear den visits by helicopter in portions of 3 years, and this was restricted to incidental observations of bear den locations collected by helicopter pilots or by other people working in the area. We did not attempt a systematic survey of the entire mine study area, but we sampled the occurrence of dens and noted the physical characteristics and the locations. We did helicopter surveys of active beaver colonies in the fall of 2005 in the mine area and 2006 in the transportation corridor. And then we did surveys of harbor seal haulouts in Iliamna Lake, which were done in association with the marine surveys that Bob will be discussing more tomorrow in 3 different years, 2005, 2007, and 2008. So this slide shows two things. It shows the red lines are the distribution of the center lines of the systematic strip transects that we surveyed, and then the light blue shading, which may not be terribly visible, is this is the area that was surveyed for beavers in fall of 2005, and then the dark blue lines are the areas that were surveyed on the anadromous stream survey or the bear survey in fall of 2000 or in August of 2004. I should mention that there's a lot of talk about the mine study area and the transportation corridor study area, and I don't know if Terry touched on this, but it's kind of an arbitrary line, but it's based on drainage headwater areas for streams that drain this way and then that way. So when I talk about the mine study area, I'm talking about the area to the west of this line, and transportation corridor is to the east. This is a regional map view that shows you the much larger areas that were surveyed for bears. That's the red outline. This was in May 2009. This was done in conjunction with the Department of Fish and Game. And then the blue and purple outlines here. The purple is the area that was surveyed for moose in the mine study area, and then the blue outline is the area that was surveyed for moose in the transportation corridor study area in April 2010. So we'll go into a little bit more background and then some of the results. So the Mulchatna herd of caribou is a fairly striking example of a dramatic increase and then a dramatic decline of caribou herd in Alaska. Years ago, in the early 70s and 80s, it was on the order of 15 to 20,000, and then it really took off. During the 80s to the mid-90s, peaked around 200,000 in the mid-90s, and then has subsequently declined about 85% in a fairly short order. So it's a big spike and drop. During that period, the Department of Fish and Game and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service and BLM had a very effective telemetry program going on, and they were able to compile basically a 30-year data set. It's been more than 30 years now, of radio-collared animals. Most of the data early on were from standard radio collars, or VHF collars, very high-frequency radio collars that you have to fly and locate them from an aircraft to get a location. And then in later years, they began using satellite collars, which you don't have to fly to locate, and which broadcast their location to a satellite, and then you can obtain it that way. You get a lot more data from each animal because you don't have to actually go out and fly and find them, so you get data in all kinds of weather and seasons and day length. So we established a cooperative agreement with the Technical Working Group for access to those data specifically for use in the environmental baseline data analysis. I already mentioned the dramatic population fluctuation in the herd, but attending that was a really widespread expansion of range use and highly variable use of different areas of range over large areas of southwest Alaska during that period. Basically, they expanded west around the mid-90s, 94, shortly before the herd peaked, or about the time the herd peaked. And since then, they've declined rather dramatically, but the range use has remained fairly widespread. Past use of the Mayan study area was primarily during wintering, calving, and then the summer insect season, or a time when caribou biologists refer to post-calving aggregations, when caribou get together after calving in very large groups, and a lot of that is related to insect avoidance. Go to high elevation areas to get away from mosquitoes, and also estrid flies, parasitic flies, and other biting flies. Should mention there was a little bit of radiotelemetry work done in the mine area in the early 90s. Recently, the use of the mine area has been pretty much restricted by large numbers of animals to the post-calving period. There isn't much indication of much wintering or calving in the area since the herd expanded and grew and expanded and moved more to the west. And there's very little use in the transportation corridor east of the New Halen. So this map, the yellow outline, shows the entire area of within which radio telemetry locations were recorded during that period of almost 30 years. Draw your attention down here to the corner. There are 468 VHF collars, regular radio collars, 34 satellite collars, and over 12,000 locations that were used for this analysis. And about 3/4 of those collars were on females, and about 1/4 of them were on bulls. The other thing I would draw your attention to is this red outline here is what we described as the greater mine study area early on in the process to sort of focus a number of the analyses on or draw inferences to. And then this little purple spot in the middle of that, or near the top of that, is the actual deposit location, right where the arrow is. So you can see the herd really covers a lot of area in southwestern Alaska. So we broke the year into 5 different periods by date: spring, calving, summer, autumn, and winter, and looked at the proportion of radio collars that were within that greater mine study area, that red outline, during each of those seasons, a proportion of the number of collar locations. And this was based on a reduced number of the locations to avoid undue influence by any particular satellite collared animal that may have had a whole lot more locations. We looked at the data set to use 1 location per animal per month over that 30-year period. So you see that it's a fairly low proportion. This is 1%, 2%, 3%. In that greater mine area, it's fairly low during spring and calving. This is over all years. And then was highest during the summer post-calving period, and then dropped again during autumn and winter. So we prepared individual maps. We broke the that time period into 3 decades, just for convenience: the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and then the lower right here represents all years combined, and used fixed kernel density analysis to kind of describe the distribution of collar locations within these areas. And so the dark green is what we call high density use. It represents the 50% contour for these kernel distributions. The lighter green is what we call medium density. That's a 75% contour, and then the lightest area is the 95% contour, which we refer to as low density use. And this is just to provide a snapshot of what the distribution of the collared animals that were available in each of these decades was like during each season. I'm just using an example of the summer range here in the interest of time, but we did this for all 5 seasons. And this is the season during which the greatest use of the mine study area occurred. So you see here early on, and part of this also represents the distribution of where the collars were put out, but the Mulchetna herd was restricted. When they were smaller, they were restricted to this area to a greater extent in the eastern portion of their range, and then as the herd grew and expanded, they moved westward. And again, much of this westward expansion was, if you look at a paper that was published by the technical working group, they identified 1994 as kind of the year during which they really noticed this westward expansion. So we don't capture that threshold on this map, but this is just for general descriptive purposes over a longer period of time. And now you see there's sort of this bimodal or 2-part use of the range, and there's a lot more use to the west and to the east. Some years they kind of split, and animals will stay to the east or the west. The calving has moved more to the central northern part of the area. So this kind of gives you a flavor of how range use has changed over time, and if you look at all the series of 5 maps, it'll give you a pretty good idea, both by time period and by season, of how caribou use that area. So this provides a summary of the systematic strip transect surveys that we did in 2004 and 2005. You see here the maximum number we saw that year was almost 10,000 on July 1st. The red circles represent those July sightings. Sorry, the mouse doesn't want to cooperate. And you can see here that they tend to be clustered in the higher elevation areas, which is consistent with insect season use, at least at this time. That's where they were mostly seen. And then the other incidental sightings or sightings from other surveys are shown in different colors. You see there's a number of smaller observations in June. That was mostly during some of the bird surveys, point counts. The next year, we didn't see any large aggregations. There were some there in late June, which we just missed, and so we mapped trails, and there had been heavy use here along the Cook-Tule, North Fork of the Cook-Tule, and then we also looked at trails, and a number of these were sort of perennial trails formed in upland areas where there's repeated use by caribou over time during the insect season primarily. That year, the most we saw in any of the transect surveys was 146 in early December. They were scattered about the area, mostly down here to the south. Again, in 2006 and 2007, maximum of 5,000 and 2,000 at the time we did the surveys in late June. And the pattern among all the surveys was fairly consistent. It tended to get to larger groups to the north and to the west, which is consistent with the results of the telemetry surveys that have been conducted by the technical working group over the years. Brown bear is another important species in the area, both for hunting and viewing. It's a tightly managed species by the Department of Fish and Game. It's only open in odd years, falls and even year springs, so that it's not an annual season all year long. There's a real gradient through the study area from the mine study area out to the coast. It's a moderate density population inland, something on the order of 40 to 50 based on previous work by the Department of Fish and Game out to the coast, where it's much higher, up to 150 bears per 1,000 square kilometers. there's clear reasons to be looking at bears, concern for safety of humans and bears, potential for attraction to areas of activity. There's a lot of information available on bear responses to industrial activities and ways to deal with that. And concern for the species is a low reproductive rate, which makes it easy to overharvest, and a reason to avoid unnecessary mortality in a management context. The species is notable for impressive seasonal concentrations in coastal bays and in salmon spawning streams. So we collected incidental observations of bears, and we also looked at them on our systematic strip transect surveys, but there was a desire to try and get a more robust and precise population estimate. So we working with the Department of Fish and Game, employed this line transect distance sampling method that the department has developed over the last decade or so, 15 years or so. It was funded by both Pebble and the Department of Fish and Game. And the area I already showed you was Game Management Unit 9B South in the southeastern part of Game Management Unit 17B. This is a now standard method that Earl Becker developed in conjunction with Professor Kwong at the University in Fairbanks, using randomly selected transects along elevation contours, really blanketed a very large area. And it's an intensive, expensive effort using 5 super cubs over a period of several weeks or 10 days to 2 weeks. Looked at 1,000 transects over 9,800 square kilometers of bear habitat, and came up with 2 estimates, or a range of estimates. The development of these sitability models for this method is an area of active research, and so there wasn't one single answer. In fact, Earl Becker's been honing this method as a result of some of the things he learned in this survey regarding how you construct the sitability models using 2 different observers versus a single sitability model just for the aircraft alone. The brown bears were found over the entire area, and black bears were not. In fact, there are too few found to really come up with a population estimate. And I've already mentioned these estimates. For 9A is the coastal area. We'll talk about more tomorrow. 150 brown bears per 1,000 square kilometers and 85 black bears per 1,000 square kilometers. And most of that is in the northern part of the area, north of Iliamna Lake. So this just shows you the distribution of the sightings from that survey in May 2009. The yellow dots are the brown bears, and one of the caveats for the survey method is that it's done at a time of year when bears are recently out of dens, and so it may not necessarily be a good picture of seasonal habitat use of an area, but because bears move a lot, and they tend to den in more upland areas, so it's a good method for estimating population number and density. It's not necessarily anything more than a seasonal snapshot in terms of distribution, because later in the season, clearly there'd be a lot more bears in a number of these salmon spawning streams. So there's lots of movement. The red dots are black bears. You see there really aren't many. There were a few in the mine area, and then in the transportation corridor there's more, and out near the coast. And in previous surveys that have been done, black bears were much more numerous to the north of Lake Clark than they were to the south or west. So this is just results from the strip transect surveys and also incidental observations. The observations from the surveys are indicated by stars, and those from other surveys are circles. And basically this just shows that bears are present in the study area pretty much throughout the entire season when they're out of dens, and they tend to concentrate at different times of year on salmon spawning streams. No surprise there. Same type of information for the following 2 years. This is a picture, a map of the various bear dens that we examined in the study area. They were found at most elevations, particularly on slopes in the upland areas, but also in some fairly low areas and even down near the lake. We also, in the course of this, found some wolf dens, old wolf dens, no active ones. And we were able to get some physical descriptions of the distribution of denning. The area's known to be used for denning for quite a while. It's hard to evaluate because these types of survey information aren't available over broad areas. It's hard to evaluate whether it's of particular importance to the bear population or not. Moose, clearly an important species, high interest for local harvest. Some sport hunting, but this is not a great place to go for moose for sport hunters. It's a fairly low density population. The moose have to contend with a lot of bears, and when the Mulchat caribou herd grew, then the number of wolves also increased, and so that put some additional pressure on moose populations. Winter concentrations have been known to occur in the eastern edge of the mine study area. For instance, in the 1980s, the Alaska Habitat Management Guides Atlas project identified Upper Tulare Creek and some of the large rivers in the transportation corridor as being important wintering areas for moose. The Department of Fish and Game has historical data in what are called trend count areas. These are fairly defined areas where they do repeated surveys. They weren't necessarily, broad-scale population surveys, but by looking at the same area over time, you develop a population trend estimate. And the National Park Service has done some surveys in Lake Clark National Park to the north. So again, I mentioned this. We used Fish and Game's GSPE method in April 2010. We were going to try and do it in November, which is when the Department of Fish and Game does most of their moose surveys, but you need to have adequate snow conditions, and that's a real problem down in this part of the world in the fall. It's not possible to get decent snow for surveys in any particular year. So the distribution of moose changes a bit between the two. They tend to be higher and more dispersed in the fall, in November. You can also get sex and age information because the bulls still have their antlers by April. They tend to be in lower elevation areas and more concentrated along riparian areas, and the bulls have dropped their antlers. But you're constrained by the weather. This just gives you an example of the grid that was used to allocate the survey quadrats. This is a standard grid that the Department of Fish and Game developed. I think it's 2 minutes of latitude by 5 minutes of longitude. They've established it over the whole state, and then these grid units are used to allocate survey effort. So in this case, the cells with some shading show the ones that were surveyed. The light blue ones are no moose seen, for instance here. And then there's no case where it was just a single moose, and then more than one moose were seen here. This is another sighting of moose that was made incidentally outside. Was just added for general interest, and another set of moose, another pair of moose here. Not on the quadrat surveys. In other words, not used for the population estimate. But we did also do some surveys of the mine area in past years, and in late winter, and did not find many moose in the area. Most of them were the ones we did find were down in the lower elevation areas near Upper Tulare Creek, and that's probably because of the distribution of food plants and also the high amount of snow that falls in these higher elevation areas of the study area. So these are the results, probably a little more detailed than anybody wants to see, but and I can talk about this a little bit more tomorrow when we talk about the transportation corridor, but that is a more, there's more moose in the transportation corridor than in the mine area. Anyway, you come up with a population estimate, 33 estimated in the mine survey area, with a pretty wide confidence interval because of the dramatic fluctuation in numbers of moose among your survey quadrats, and fairly low density. This just shows some of the other incidental observations on the right-hand side, and other observations during the aerial transect surveys. Moose, red fox, otters. One observation of a tundra hare, which is otherwise known as an Alaska hare, or the local folks call them jackrabbits. It's not a snowshoe hare. It's a Alaskan endemic. This is about as far to the southeast as this species occurs. It's more common on the western coastal tundra, Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, and up to the Seward Peninsula. And also observations of wolves, wolverines, river otters. This shows the results of the beaver survey that was done in October 2005. There had been some high-resolution aerial imagery flown early in the project, and the people that did the mapping also, happily for us, mapped all the beaver dams they saw. So that gave me a pretty good idea of where to look on the aerial surveys. These surveys are flown in the fall, before snowfalls, after beavers have cut their winter food supply, and there's a cache near the lodge, and so you can find active lodges, active colonies, by the presence of a food cache near a lodge. You can see quite a few beavers in the area. This is sort of surprising. You fly around there in the summertime, and it's like, oh, that looked like an abandoned lodge, but it turned out that many of them were active, especially clustered along Upper Clark Creek and some of the tributaries here, but also in sort of perched wetlands up in the mine area, and then lots of them along the Cook-Chuli tributaries. As I said, we didn't do targeted fur bearer surveys, but we looked at harvest records the Department of Fish and Game provided for a number of years. This goes from 1991 to 2004. For lynx, river otter, wolverine, wolf, and beaver, and these are species that we have records for them because the pelts have to be sealed. So there is not comparable information for marten, which does occur in the area. But you can see here, this is a bunch of what are called uniform coding units. It's an aggregated group of uniform coding units that cover the area from the mine area, and this is actually east through the transportation corridor. So this is that whole slice of country. Quite a bit of variation. The problem with looking at harvest data is you don't want to read too much into the fluctuations among years, because that may not represent the population status at all. It represents human effort, trapping effort. So you have to always keep that in mind. And basically what you see here is that, to me, it looks like trapping effort has kind of fallen off over the years. Okay, I'm done. That's it. I don't know where we go now. Is it a general question session, or?
Yeah, so what's on our agenda for right now is a short break, and then we'll come back with Brian and Terry, and expert panel will ask them questions and ask for clarifications and stuff.
Okay.
Probably good to leave your PowerPoint loaded up here in case you have to come back and refer to it.
Okay.
And we're a little bit ahead of schedule, so there's a chance we might get to public questions toward the end of today. So what, Todd, 10, 15 minutes? 15 minutes, 3:20, we'll be back.